Welcome to Science with a Twist, a podcast for curious people who enjoy exploring how science impacts our daily lives. From technology that helps the fight against COVID-19 to solutions that help clean the water we drink, is all thanks to science. In each episode, members of Thermo Fisher's scientific team talk to experts who are on the cutting edge of redefining how we exist. Let's get started.
Hello, welcome back to Science with a Twist. My name is Lloryn Hubbard. I'm the Director of Patient Diversity at PPD, part of Thermo Fisher Scientific. Safety and efficacy of drugs and biologics can vary depending on the intrinsic and extrinsic factors of our patients. So ensuring that clinical trials adequately represent the populations most affected by disease is critical. It aligns with ensuring strong science, patient safety, and evolving regulatory requirements. Most importantly, we as an industry are obligated to lead the way in developing effective and safe products for all patients. For this episode, we are joined by Nik Kolatkar, VP of Scientific Operations and Evidence Generation at Genentech, to discuss the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our clinical trials and how Nik and his team are working to ensure diverse populations are represented in their clinical trials. Nik, welcome to Science with a Twist.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
No problem. Glad you're here. I think it's important to begin our discussion today with a really clear understanding of three principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So can you talk us through the meaning behind each, specifically to help our audience gain a deeper understanding of the underlying barriers and value of meaningful implementation of these elements across clinical studies and, of course, through medical affairs?
Sure, Lauren. So I think it's really important to set the stage with some of the definitions, and I think it's been helpful that FDA actually came out with guidance to industry on this topic initially going back to November of 2020, and has since updated some updated draft guidance in April of this year, and it's specifically really around the topic of diversity plans that sponsors should be thinking about in terms of how to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented minorities in clinical trials. But it does provide a nice framework, I think, for how to think about diversity, equity, inclusion in the setting of clinical research. I think to make it simple, I sort of distilled it down from the guidance, but essentially diversity is really making sure everyone is represented. Equity is more about being fair to everyone who's involved. And then inclusion is really about creating a welcoming environment, for everyone involved. So that's sort of how I think about the three. And each of the three are important.
Totally, completely agree. I think also just one way to improve health equity is through diverse representation in clinical trials, as we all can agree, where treatments are really first beginning to be tested. So how do you work to ensure diverse and underrepresented populations are participating in clinical trials? Also, what are the ramifications if diversity is not appropriately represented in a clinical trial population?
Yeah, so I think one thing where we've realized where we need to start off with, really, before we even get into a clinical trial, is just a good understanding, based on the literature of the epidemiology of the disease for that particular trial in terms of race and ethnicity. So, whether it's breast cancer or lung cancer or, neurologic diseases or ophthalmologic diseases, we need to know, what does the epidemiology look like in terms of race and ethnicity, because it varies substantially by disease, right? So the percentage of Black or Hispanic patients with diabetic macular edema could differ quite substantially from that in multiple sclerosis or triple negative breast cancer. So I think, we start off with really doing a very thorough look at the literature, and that gives us a benchmark essentially for what we're striving for in each study. But that's only, part of the puzzle. I think then we really need to help, to your point, ensure that diverse and underrepresented populations actually part in the clinical trials. And there, I think we really start from the beginning in terms of the design of the study and making sure that we're meeting underrepresented patients where they are in the community, not only in terms of site selection, but also in terms of, making sure we have multicultural patient materials, in multiple languages, and making sure that our investigators are trained, in how to present the study in a culturally sensitive way, in a way that builds trust, amongst the patients who are looking to participate. So I think so those are some of the key things we're doing. I think in terms of the ramifications, if diversity is not appropriately represented, I think we unfortunately saw this clearly playing out during the pandemic, actually. We were seeing a lot of the data were emerging that many underrepresented patients, particularly Black and Hispanic patients, were having worse outcomes with COVID. Yet, when we were looking at a lot of the trials, for vaccines and therapeutics, those patients were not being included in those studies. And then as a result, from a scientific standpoint, when the results of the studies came out, people were understandably questioning, are these results that we're seeing, generalizable to all the patients with the disease, and especially the patients who are having the worst outcomes. So I think we saw that kind of play out in real time in COVID. And that was where, as a company, Genentech actually, was seeing that happening in real time. And we started a dedicated underrepresented minority study in patients with COVID-19 pneumonia called Impacta, which was a study of one of our medicines, tocilizumab. And we enrolled 389 participants, with 84% coming from underrepresented populations, and was really the first study to do that. And that was a positive study and really helped give us confidence that we knew that our medicines worked in all patients. And it complemented some of the other studies we were doing. And the great thing was, not only did we complete that study and we had the data and really gave us a lot more confidence in our medicine, but that trial also recruited in record time. Which was one of the myths, that people had been saying that, oh, we could have a more diverse trial population, but it's going to slow down the study, and we don't want to do that. So this study, we had 84% from underrepresented populations, and actually was one of the fastest studies that Genentech ever enrolled, and was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So it was really a great result overall.
That's amazing. 84% is super impressive. And I also think that, to your point around COVID, just the idea that we were all in this pressure cooker to deliver these patient populations, and we all did it. And so it really did remove any of the bias or the preconceived notions that we couldn't enroll diverse patient populations, right? Especially in the US. So I think that's just really a really good take home, that, the idea that diverse populations are harder to find. Sure, they might be more challenging, but we can do it. As an industry, we've done it, and COVID really showed that. So
Exactly,
I think that's awesome. We know that inequities in healthcare have long existed, and that disenfranchised populations have felt the ramifications of disproportionate access and care. So Genentech recently invested in a study to dig deeper into those perceptions and experiences of disenfranchised individuals to identify challenges, barriers, and opportunities to improve health equity. Can you please give us a quick overview of the key findings from this study? Is this the same study, or is this a different study?
So this is actually a survey that Genentech started back in 2020, and this was led by our Chief Diversity Office, and it's been repeated on an annual basis. And essentially, this is an online questionnaire, which included roughly 2,000 US patients, and it was essentially 1,000 patients from the general population, and then another 1,000 who specifically identified as in terms of being part of one of four groups, and that was Black, Latinx, LGBTQ plus, or low socioeconomic status. And then in addition to the 2,000 patients, the survey also went to around 400 healthcare providers who were either physicians, nurses, pharmacists, and physician assistants. And really it was asking questions around inequities in the US healthcare system, and kind of trends over time. And it's a detailed survey, and some of the results on the Genentech website, but just in summary, I think some of the key findings were more than half of the medically disenfranchised patients, so I think it was 54% actually in the survey, but felt that essentially that the healthcare system was essentially rigged against them. And they kind of overwhelmingly agreed that healthcare inequities had worsened over the course of the pandemic. Because we've had a chance to look at these data from 2020 to 2022. Mm-hmm. And healthcare providers also similarly agree that the system does not really seem to be serving patients, as it should. And only about 50% of healthcare providers really felt that the system was acting in the best interest of society as a whole. And I guess importantly, about 80% of healthcare providers also felt that health misinformation or lack of trust was kind of a serious threat to the system. But I think one thing we did find, where there was agreement between both healthcare providers and patients really was that a positive, trusting relationship with a patient's healthcare provider is one of the key factors in terms of building trust in the system overall. And we're finding the same thing in our clinical studies. So the trusting relationship between the investigator and the participant is super important in terms of patients, wanting to be part of clinical research.
Really interesting. So bring us to present day. So based on these findings from this survey, what steps is Genentech taking now in clinical studies to make this research more inclusive? And I think you just were trying to touch on it a bit.
Yeah, exactly. So we're really, as I mentioned, starting with making sure we have a good understanding of the epidemiology and disease. We're really looking very closely at our site selection to include both community-based and urban-centered sites, who have access to large underrepresented populations. But then beyond that, I think we're also really trying to make sure we recruit investigators who have experience in enrolling patients, underrepresented patients into clinical research, and also a passion for health equity research, because that passion comes through, in how they present the trial to patients and in their ability to build trust with their communities. And then finally, we're trying to also break down, any logistic barriers that may be hindering patients from being able to participate in research. So in terms of simplifying the logistics of trials, simplifying things like transportation to study visits, so making we're working with a number of different transportation providers to essentially provide like an Uber-like service that patients can just, basically get free transportation to the trial without having to worry about traffic and parking and all of that.
Right.
And then finally, I think, making sure we're utilizing multilingual and culturally sensitive patient materials, which is very important.
Yeah, all of those are really great steps. I think that especially about the sites being able to effectively enroll and communicate and make those patients feel comfortable, make patients from underrepresented populations feel comfortable is so important. So it is powerful to hear how Genentech is actively taking accountability and moving the healthcare systems towards equity and partnerships. We know it's critical for a clinical trial population to accurately represent the real world population who will be taking the drug to ensure the best healthcare products are developed to help the people who need them most. As is typical in the industry, many global pharma and biotech companies partner with contract research organizations, CROs, to support key clinical research functions, including solutions to ensure accessibility and diverse patient recruitment, which has been especially challenging and enlightening during the pandemic. Genentech and the Perry Post-Approval Studies team of PPD, a part of Thermo Fisher Scientific, recently partnered on one such solution, a decentralized clinical trial, or as we call it, DCT. So let's talk about DCTs and what they mean for patients and drug development. First, can you explain what a DTC is, what they are, and the critical benefits of virtual trials, and possibly share an example of a recent DTC Genentech study that was executed?
Sure. So as you said, decentralized clinical trials, or DCTs, is there's sort of a lot of buzz about this term right now, but at its core, it's really very simply just about essentially democratizing clinical research and improving the patient experience by meeting patients where they are instead of having them come to kind of the ivory tower for clinical research, which had been the old sort of more traditional paradigm. And I think, the reason why it's called decentralized is it's essentially, trying to move the clinical research, where the clinical research happens kind of closer to the patient, as opposed to centralizing it in these ivory towers. And you hear that same terminology, there's a lot of parallels to, you hear a lot of talk about decentralized finance, for example, with the blockchain. And that's the same concept of, how do you make finance more secure, more convenient, more efficient for consumers, to access without needing to go through the large bank. So, from a clinical research perspective, our approach to decentralized trials is really to take kind of a patient-first approach to think about, how a decentralized trial might help to improve either quality, speed, cost, or the patient experience. Because I think unless a decentralized trial is driving improvement in one of those things, it may not be the right trial to to do a decentralized trial in. So for example, we do many complex cancer trials which require IV infusions, where the patient has to come in to get that, as well as hospital monitoring or complex imaging. And in that kind of trial, a decentralized approach may not necessarily make sense because the patient has to come to a hospital or to a center to do all of that. But in other situations where you might have an oral therapy or a subcutaneous therapy or something that doesn't require a lot of sophisticated imaging, then you can do a lot more at the patient's home, to make it more convenient. And a great example of this was actually a trial we did in collaboration with PPD. And this was with one of our medicines called Phesgo, which is a fixed dose combination of pertuzumab and Herceptin for HER2 positive breast cancer. And the great thing about Phesgo is that it combines the two medicines into a single subcutaneous injection that does not require in-hospital monitoring and really can be given at the patient's home. And the trial we were doing was actually an expanded access trial for Phesgo, which would allow patients to get access to enroll into the trial and get access to Phesgo before the drug was approved. And the trial was starting, right at the start of the pandemic, where patients were really hesitant to go into clinics to see their doctor or to get infusions or things like that because of their fear about getting COVID. So actually, we decided to do the Phesgo early access program as a decentralized trial. And we essentially, were able to, use home nursing and video conferencing to essentially allow patients to, get the medicine and have their visits from their home. And we used remote kind of patient education to help answer questions and remote platforms, to help collect some of the clinical data, which was really a win-win for both the patients, who, where it was much more convenient and they didn't have to worry about the risk of getting COVID by going in, and also for us because it was more efficient and convenient for patients. So I think that was a great example of industry working together with our CRO partners and using a decentralized paradigm where it made sense for patients to really achieve a win-win.
Awesome. Improving diversity within clinical trials is critical to begin closing gaps in healthcare equity and to better develop drugs that serve populations and people who need them most. Where do we go from here to ensure that we as an industry continue to consider the care pathway for people from diverse backgrounds? How do we improve clinical research and expand treatment access to a more diverse patient population?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we're thinking about this very carefully at Genentech, and we're trying to, not make sure that our efforts in terms of improving diversity in clinical trials is not just a one-off thing, that we really make this part of just the routine way that we do every clinical trial. We did the Impacta study that I mentioned earlier during the pandemic, where we had a very good experience in terms of being able to recruit a largely, minority study in record time with very high quality, and really helped, complement our other trials in terms of our, more robust scientific evidence in underrepresented population. But we wanted to make sure that wasn't just a one-off for Genentech, and we wanted to see could we replicate that in a non-pandemic setting, because there were a lot of unique aspects to the pandemic. So we wanted to say, could we do the same thing in a more chronic disease? We took a look at a lot of our therapies in chronic disease, and what we realized was in multiple sclerosis, we have really an industry-leading therapy called Ocrevus. But what we realized was that in the Ocrevus registrational studies, we did not have very robust, representation from underrepresented minorities. So we said, this could be a great opportunity to run a dedicated study to generate evidence with Ocrevus in underrepresented minorities and make sure that results that we found in our pivotal studies are also broadly applicable to all patients with MS. So we ran a study called CHIMES, and this study is still ongoing, but is now fully recruited, and where we recruited around 200 patients with multiple sclerosis. And this time, 100% of the trial was underrepresented minorities. And here we were able to, again, recruit 100% of this trial with Black patients as well as Hispanic patients in the US. And we also, for the first time, included patients outside of the US in countries that were also underrepresented from global trials. So We included patients in CHIMES from Kenya in Africa, because one thing we've realized too is that even though Africa represents almost 25% of the global population, less than 1% of clinical trials, include patients from Africa. So, we thought this could be a good opportunity to also, include a country and a site in Africa which was very well equipped to run clinical research, and where the local country felt that by generating some data in Kenya, it could help them in their discussions with their local payer to get broader reimbursement in Kenya, as well as accelerated regulatory approval. So the good news is that trial is now fully recruited, has over 200 patients in it, and also, just like Impacta, it recruited in record time. So we recruited that study almost 3 months early. We're expecting data from that study in Q4 this year. So that's just another example of really where we're trying to make sure that these are not one-off studies. And the goal then is to take the learnings from CHIMES in multiple sclerosis and to feed that back to our pipeline programs so that our registrational studies can also become more diverse from the outset. And we've done that. So the learnings from CHIMES, we've now fed back to a phase 3 study we're doing with an investigational molecule in multiple sclerosis. And they're including many of the same sites and taking some of the same learnings from CHIMES into our pipeline.
Very cool. Really impressive stuff, guys. I mean, 100% is unheard of these days. And the idea that you also went to Africa, which is a very missed market, if you will, in clinical trials, is just really, really amazing. So as we've heard from you, there is real opportunity to make a significant progress in the education and importance of diversity in clinical trials. So what is the vision for your work in the future?
Well, I think our vision, as I mentioned, is that we really need to make enrolling a diverse and representative population really a routine part of how we conduct all of our trials, which will not only increase the robustness of our research, but it will also help ensure, broad patient access. And as we've seen from a few studies now, can not only will not slow down studies, but if done right, can even accelerate trials. And if we can do all of that can really represent a true win-win, for patients, for us as a company, and for society as a whole. So that's kind of our overarching vision here.
Nice. Nik, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us and the work you're doing to prioritize patient representation and addressing barriers in clinical trial diversity and health equity. We live in an increasingly diverse world, and to deliver the best quality care, we must really embrace and prioritize diversity by putting the best interests of every patient first. If any of our listeners are interested in learning more about the peri-post-approval studies and real-world evidence solutions at PPD, a part of Thermo Fisher Scientific, you can visit us at www.ppd.com and click on the link to peri and post-approval from our solutions menu in the top navigation bar. Until next time, this is Science with a Twist.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Science with a Twist. This show is brought to you by Thermo Fisher Scientific, the world leader in serving science. If you enjoyed this episode, then follow Science with a Twist wherever you get your favorite podcasts.